Good afternoon. A warm welcome to all of you to today's Blasey Center webinar on U.S. Vatican relations and historical perspective from Ronald Reagan to Joe Biden. I am Mark Massa, and I have the great good fortune to serve as director of the Blasey Center for Religion and American Public Life at Boston College, which is hosting this event. I invite you to view all our spring events, which is quite a lineup. You can go to bc.edu/Boisy, B-O-I-S-I. We have an excellent panel to begin our conversation today. Peter Martin, former Foreign Service Officer with the U.S. State Department and now Special Assistant to the University President of Boston College. Father Charles Gallagher of the Society of Jesus teaches in Boston College's History Department and studies Vatican diplomacy and U.S. foreign relations. Father Oliver Rafferty, also of the Society of Jesus, is in BC's History Department and is a professor of modern Irish and ecclesiastical history. My sincere thanks to the three of you for being with us today. Our format, for those of you viewing, will be as follows. We're going to divide our webinar today into two segments. The entire event will be 60 minutes. The first part of our conversation this afternoon will be a conversation between our panelists with me and with each other. And after about 30 or 35 minutes, we will open the conversation up to those of you who are viewing this, who want to ask questions about issues brought up by our panelists, or perhaps about issues that have not been brought up. To do this, we ask you to please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to send in your questions to us. And if you want to address the question to a specific panelist, please say who that is. So let me begin. This is addressed to all three of our panelists today. How would you describe the relations between the Vatican and the United States over the course of the past 30 years? That is, between our two most recent Irish presidents, Ronald Reagan and Joe Biden. And part of my question, I guess, proceeds from conversations I've been having with you. How dependent are those relations between the United States government and the Vatican? How dependent are those on who is sitting in the chair of Peter or in the Oval Office? Or is this like the federal government, that there's a whole core of dedicated and very smart professional people who work on both sides of this, and most of it is in their hands? So jump in there wherever you would like.
So, I mean, I think it's true, as you say, that if relations are governed by professionals, both in the American side and at the Holy See, but doubtless personalities do play an important part. And it's clear that some popes have got on better with some presidents than others. And one only has to think of the most recent president, President Trump, almost from the start, even before he was elected. Pope Francis was making all sorts of noises which were less than diplomatic, shall we say, with relation to Trump. During the election campaign, the Pope made the statement that one shouldn't be building walls but bridges, and anyone who thinks of building walls instead of bridges is not a Christian. An immensely strong assertion for the Pope to make, and one that did not go down well with Mr. Trump. And that kind of, I think, got things off to a bad start so far as that presidency was concerned. And I think there's probably a certain sense in which things did not improve from that particular base. But perhaps Peter has more insight in this than I do.
Well, no, I mean, I think you make a really good point. I think there's definitely a lot that happens from the top that can influence the rest. But I do think, I mean, I worked at the Vatican from 2003 to 2007 in the U.S. Embassy at the Vatican, and then from 2014 to 17. So I worked under three presidents and three popes. And for me, I don't dispute what you're saying, but I think that the bottom line for me was more one of continuity and sort of strong relations and the depth of the relationship. And I think that despite the truth of what you're saying, I think some things work to mitigate any problems that come up at the top level. I think the Holy See and the US have shared interests, shared values generally. And at one point, our national security strategy for the US talked about human dignity, which couldn't be much further off from the Holy See's focus. I also think there are fewer elements in the way of the relationship as they would in traditional other bilateral relationships. Like we don't have a trade relationship with the Vatican that's going to cause trouble. We're not trying to sell the Vatican gardens any tractors or anything. We're not going to withhold or threaten to withhold military aid from the Swiss Guard. So those things don't get in the way. And I think there's also, it's a multi-layered bureaucracy and relationship, as Father Massa was alluding to also. You have the embassy and the ambassador and the people and the diplomats who work in the embassy. You've got the foreign ministry basically of the Vatican, and there's day-to-day relationship work that goes on there, working on third country issues, working on what's happening in Venezuela or religious freedom in China or any number of things. So I think those things do help to even things out.
Yeah, just picking up from Peter's observations, I think taking it from a historical angle, there is a bit of a problem in the sense that the archives for the Vatican for the period this question is meant to answer are closed. And we will not have a true understanding of the diplomatic relationship for at least 75, probably 50 or 75 years. My view is that my view is I'm a little skeptical of the relationship itself because I think Americans tend to place it with much more power than it does because of the moral weight of the Vatican. But in many ways, the Holy See is just a microstate, and it's a microstate that has its own interests. And what can be difficult is that the interests of that microstate oftentimes do not jibe with American policy. And in diplomacy, that is those rough edges usually are what's left to be tamped down rather than to be made public. The other issue I see coming present in the last 30 years, which to me is a little bit of a red flag, is we have the re-arrival now of secret diplomacy under Francis. The Cardinal Secretary of State, Pietro Cardinal Parolin, has used secret diplomacy effectively for the interests of the Vatican in negotiating the Cuban thaw 2014, 2015, and the China policy. Now, I wonder where Americans stand on just the concept of the employment of secret diplomacy as a tactic, and so I'll leave it at that.
So by secret diplomacy, Charlie, let me pursue this a little bit. By secret diplomacy, you mean off-the-record diplomacy that's not reported in public media?
Right. Yeah, it's behind closed doors, between principals, no readout, no communiques. No one is, except the principals, are to know what's being talked about.
Interesting.
But it's not true of quite a lot of diplomacy. And it seems to me that we do have sufficient kind of public record to make some sort of intelligent judgments about the relationship at a diplomatic level between America and the Holy See since the time that Reagan established an American ambassador. For example, Ambassador Rooney has written a kind of an interesting book about his time at the Vatican and has sketched, shall we say, something of a kind of brief history. We also know, for example, that when Cheney went to visit John Paul II, I think either 2004, 2005, just before the Pope died, that visit was not even on the front page of L'Osservatore Romano. It was on page 5. And what's more, there was no photograph, as there normally is in these things, so that we can gauge the sort of the low points and the high points, it seems to me, of American-Vatican relations, although I concede, of course, we will not know the whole story until the archives are opened. But we do have indications, frankly, of how that relationship has been over the last 30 years. One is only to take the two Gulf Wars, for example, and it's absolutely clear that where the Vatican stood on that. So much so that before the second Gulf War, Cardinal Pio Laghi was sent to Washington, causing Condoleezza Rice to fling herself into a bit of a tiz about his presence in the capital. Why is he here? Apparently, she asked 4 American cardinals. So that it's not, as I would suggest, it's not as closed a book, perhaps, as you might otherwise be suggesting.
Peter, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that I'm sort of, as a diplomat, or as a former diplomat, I guess I think it's important to have secrecy sometimes. In the case of Cuba, I don't think that if the behind the scenes negotiations that occurred at first with the Vatican, US, and Cuba, and some others helping, if that had become public, I think there would have been a lot of people who mobilized to stop it. And maybe that's a good thing from some people's perspective. But I think that it's necessary. If we may talk about WikiLeaks later and the damage that caused to the relationship, and I think that was another example of how diplomacy is something that has to be done sometimes in secret. I wouldn't say in secret as much as behind closed doors. I think the China case is a little bit different because the idea that the Vatican's agreement with China regarding the appointment of bishops hasn't been made public, to me, is a little bit different from the negotiations that go on before an agreement is made, I suppose.
Charlie, you started laughing there for a little bit.
Yeah, I know that the press is going to publish the public actions and of the Pope, but it's precisely what I'm seeing in the historical arc is that when the effective diplomatic tracks are determined, it seems recently that the current administration for the Vatican, for the Holy See, wants to go into the secret track, and that's kind of new. So both in China and on Cuba, that was where they decided to go, and so Peter eloquently explained why that has to be. In the past, the only thing I'm saying is that in the past, other secretaries of state of the Holy See have not been so quick to employ secret diplomacy as a means to effective negotiations.
Interesting.
It does strike me that there is a big difference between Cuba and China so far as American and Holy See sort of relations are concerned, and that is that in the case of Cuba, the Americans and the Holy See were more or less on the same side, because after all, the Holy See acts as an intermediary between Castro and the Castro administration and Obama to try to kind of regularize the relationship between Cuba and the United States. Whereas in China, it seems to me that we are in altogether different kind of territory, in the sense that if Biden, as he's given some indication of doing so, follows to some extent the Trump policy with regard to China, that is going to bring, it seems to me, America at one level into collision with the Holy See, precisely because the Holy See is bending over backwards to try to facilitate China. Partly because, and Francis has said this, he said this on his journey to Japan, that he would like to go to visit China. And if you remember, when he went to South Korea, he was allowed to go over Chinese airspace and made a kind of a broadcast to China saying, how much he liked the Chinese people and so on and so forth. Whereas given for geopolitical purposes and issues of trade and so on, America is squaring up for, it seems to me, possibly a major fight with the Chinese. And this will not fit into what the Vatican, what the Holy See wants to get out of China in terms of making things easier for Catholics in the country. It also has, it seems to me, a naive view that there is a possibility for expansion of Catholicism in China. And naturally, it wants, that is an important kind of aspect of its outlook. And then the whole business of Francis wanting to set foot on Chinese soil as a kind of a symbolic gesture, shall we say, not just to Chinese Catholics, but to Chinese people as a whole. So it seems to me that we're dealing with two different situations with regard to Cuba and with regard to China and Holy See and American relations.
Peter, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, the China case is interesting. I think we've often had in different administrations people concerned with religious freedom, but almost always when we've offered to carry the Vatican's water, so to speak, on religious freedom issues in China, the Vatican usually tells us, you know, that's okay, we're doing all right, we're going to work on our own thing. And I think sometimes these are legitimate human rights issues that we're concerned about as the U.S. government. But it's interesting how sometimes we're pushing more than the Vatican would, and Vatican has, Holy See has his reasons for that. On the Cuba issue, that was just it was an interesting example. I mean, it was one of the few times when I think, in my experience there, when the Holy See really inserted itself in another bilateral relationship that we had to really make a big change, or to encourage us to make a big change. And I think it was interesting also because although Pope Francis, of course, had some familiarity with the situation, given where he's from, I don't know if it would have happened if he hadn't also had a lot of people around him who gave him the comfort level to go that direction. So Cardinal Parolin, former nuncio in Venezuela, so he was very familiar with the situation. The chief of staff equivalent was a former nuncio to Cuba. The deputy foreign minister also involved in Cuba. So usually, in my experience, the Vatican is not so bold, but I think Pope Francis has broken many molds, and I think he had a lot of support in that case.
Interesting.
I once heard a funny story about Castro, that he was asked, is the relationship between Cuba and America ever going to be repaired? And he said, not until there is a black man in the White House and a Latin American as Pope. So he was certainly kind of prophetic in his views.
Let me ask you this. We've been going back and forth between the names of particular pontiffs and the use of the term the Vatican as a whole diplomatic place and the U.S. government. Let me ask you about specific American presidents. Who, in your opinions, was the president or presidents who best sensed how to deal with the Vatican and had the best diplomatic sense of how to frame questions or dilemmas in ways that the Vatican and or individual popes could understand and be sympathetic with? So it could be one or could be several.
I just start from my historical perspective again. This is going to seem an unlikely candidate, but I'd like to offer Richard Nixon. And the reason is, in 1969, in March of 1969, he flew to Rome, and the Pope had extended his retreat. This is Paul VI. And Nixon stayed in Europe and made a second trip back to Rome to Paul VI. And they met for over an hour and had negotiations. Of course, Vietnam is raging in the background. But the result of these talks in 1969 between Paul VI and Nixon bring about a situation that the Vatican had wanted to reinstate for 20 years prior. They had not been able to send any representative from the United States to the Vatican since 1950. And it's actually Nixon who, in June of 1970, appoints Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. of Massachusetts as his personal representative to Paul VI. And that paves the way for Gerald Ford and for Jimmy Carter and for Ronald Reagan to start full diplomatic relations by 1980. So I think it's an unknown candidate, but that's my historical point of view.
So we have a vote for Richard Nixon, okay, counterintuitive.
I'm going to opt for Reagan, in fact, because after all, it is Reagan who brings about the establishment of full diplomatic relations between the Holy See and Washington. And he does so with very specific ideas in mind, which tune into the thinking of Pope John Paul II and of the Vatican. And that was the whole idea of dealing with communism in Eastern Europe. So in other words, they have a united front, shall we say. And this leads to all sorts of peculiarities that John Paul II receives briefings, for example, from American intelligence about what is happening in Eastern Europe. Reagan also saw John Paul as an ally in dealing with insurgents in Central America. He was very perplexed about the idea of the theology of liberation. Not that he knew too much about it, I have to say, but was perplexed about it, and therefore was delighted that John Paul II was also condemning the theology of liberation, which he did on a famous visit to Mexico, and addressed the Mexican bishops' hierarchy on the matter, with the intention that this message should be disseminated throughout the whole of Central America, and indeed South America. So it seems to me that that was a central, that relationship was of central importance. And the fact that Reagan believed the Vatican to be of sufficient importance for the purposes of American foreign policy in dealing with communism, that he goes out of his way to reestablish relations. And it was not without its problems. It's true that the Senate and the House removed the prohibition, providing money for a diplomat, an American diplomat at the Vatican. But then, when Reagan actually appointed an ambassador, there was a court case, all sorts of weird groups. Well, perhaps one shouldn't say weird, but all sorts of different groups, like the Seventh-day Adventists, the main kind of Jewish group in America, various fundamentalist Protestants, not all fundamentalists, but
I think the Southern Baptist Convention weighed in.
Southern Baptist Convention, among others, all came together to fight this. And it was started in a federal court and was fought right to the Supreme Court, which didn't give its judgment until, I think, 1986, and saying, no, it was entirely up to the president. So there was some difficulty from the point of view of Reagan, some kickback. And after all, Jerry Falwell severely castigated President Reagan, having been one of his great supporters. And now it's as if Reagan has gone over to the devil, and indeed, or at least is supping with the devil. So it seems to me that Reagan is a big figure in this. But as I say, partly because of shared policy interests between the Holy See and the United States.
Peter?
When you talk about that, Father Rafferty, I think of that backdrop of some opposition and that that stretched long before Reagan, also part of the anti-Catholic heritage of the U.S. as well. I think about the funeral of Pope John Paul. I think the largest funeral of any public figure to take place until that time, at least is what they said. And at the time, we had a huge delegation coming. It was going to be President Bush, Bush 43, Bush 41, Secretary of State, President Clinton, National Security Advisor, First Lady. Everybody was coming, and they were coming in a couple nights before the funeral, and we got word that they wanted to go directly from the airport to St. Peter's Basilica to go and pay their respects to Pope John Paul, who was lying in state. So they came in, went through the Porta della Preghiera, the side entrance to the Vatican, and there was a side area, long lines of people, as you may remember, waiting to pay their respects. Some people waiting up to 20 hours in some cases. But they came in on the side, and there were some kneelers set up. and the Vatican personnel cleared it out, and President Bush let everyone in, walked in, and because I guess there were kneelers there, and maybe because President Bush had seen other people kneeling, despite the fact that he wasn't a Catholic, he knelt, and everyone else, of course, followed suit. So you have the front page picture of the New York Times the next day is the Pope lying in state, in the background, these three American presidents kneeling before the body of the Pope, and which I don't know if anyone could have imagined in '84 when they were having those controversies.
Although President Bush was an Episcopalian who do kneel during their worship services. So
Yes, but by that stage he was a Methodist, so had cast aside his Episcopalianism.
yes.
It was the most extraordinary thing, and I knew that made a very deep impression on the Vatican. The fact that you have three American presidents who come to the funeral, and this is utterly unprecedented, naturally, and something that very much impressed Vatican officials and kind of helped at one level to kind of bond again, because after all, John Paul II and George W. didn't necessarily always have particularly harmonious relations, especially over, as we've referred to earlier, the Second Gulf War. So this is a kind of an incident which kind of provokes a greater rapprochement, shall we say, between the Holy See and Washington, because of the high level of the delegation.
So let me ask you this to the three of you then, since you just put up. Would you say that the high point of the last 30 years was the relation between Pope John Paul II and Bush? Was that in your opinion, the best rapprochement between the Vatican and the U.S. government? What would you say?
I wouldn't say it was.
Well,
Sorry, I wouldn't say it was necessarily the best because of clear differences of policy over Iraq. And, again, John Paul deeply distressed that President George W. does initiate the war. And the Pope had told him not to do so, to find another way. And then the Vatican was also deeply upset when Saddam Hussein was actually arrested. And they showed pictures on the television of Saddam Hussein, his teeth being examined and his hair being kind of examined for lice and so on and so forth. Now that made a very bad impression on the Vatican because it thought this is no way to treat an enemy. It's all very well if we have to do these things, but then why broadcast it on television? So there were kind of, as I say, highs and lows in that particular relationship, and I wouldn't have thought that it was necessarily the best. On the other hand, it is true that at one level, George W. spoke the same language as the Pope. In other words, he made no apology for the fact that he was a Christian. He made no apology for the fact that his motivation for the way he conducted the foreign policy of the United States, the way he ran American government. Now, there are different ways of estimating this, but anyway, this is his stated position, that all of this comes from his Christian faith and his daily reading of the Bible and so on and so forth. And I think at their first meeting, he poured forth this to John Paul II, about the Christian basis for his government of America and for his relationship and the relationship between America and the rest of the world. And obviously this is something that made an impression on John Paul II, naturally enough, also a man of deep faith and commitment.
And I think he visited, I don't think there's been a president who's visited the Vatican more than George W. Bush. He staffed several visits by him. And I guess, and I felt like they had a good relationship. I mean, again, Iraq did overshadow it a little bit. I would just give one, just based on my own experience, I give a couple points to Obama in that under the Obama administration, there were several foreign policy goals that were really shared, not just the Cuba cooperation, but I think the Vatican was, even though it was ultimately unsuccessful, the Secretary Kerry's push for Mideast peace, which a big focus for him, was very important to them, and they appreciated that strong effort, and the environmental issues too. And one barometer also, again, below the head of state level, John Kerry, as far as I know from my experience, he had more contact with the Vatican than any other Secretary of State that I know of. He called Cardinal Parolin on numerous occasions And I think that level of communication also really helps because you're going to get into more detail at that level than you would at head of state level generally.
Charlie?
Yeah, so I think there is one incident that really encapsulates the high point, at least from a publicity standpoint, where on July 20th, 2015, you have a president of the United States holding a press conference. This is to announce normalization of diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba. And the first thank you he gives is to the Holy See's Diplomatic Corps. That is astonishing in the history of the relationship between the United States and the Vatican. It's because now the Vatican sees itself and can project itself as useful to a superpower in a public way. And in this particular relationship, to have a president acknowledge that there was the negotiations could not have been completed without the Vatican, to my mind, someone who studies this relationship from Leo the 13th up to Francis, it was extraordinary.
Well, my previous question was about the best rapprochement. Let me ask you this. What do you think are the 2 or 3 most fraught or problematic issues that came up and caused friction between the Vatican and the U.S.? Was it the invasion of Iraq? Was it the treatment of immigrants at the borders? What would you say were the most fraught things?
Well, it strikes me that one particularly fraught incident was the Cairo Conference on Population, if you remember, in 1994, where the Americans were pushing the idea that in the final communique, the business of access to abortion for women in the third world, that has to be a kind of a prominent issue. And that caused all sorts of problems, so much so that the American ambassador at the time, I think it was Flynn, trying to persuade the United States not to push this matter, and is getting absolutely no feedback from the White House, actually comes to Washington, flew to Washington, took a taxi directly from the airport, and virtually camped outside President Clinton's door for kind of 2 days until he was admitted. And in the end, the Americans backed down. That's extraordinary kind of situation for Flynn to do so, but that certainly underlined the tension, at least in the Clinton administration. Obviously, there were all sorts of other things that Clinton did right, particularly his help in Ireland and bringing about the peace settlement there, putting parties on the road to peace. All of that was kind of music to the Vatican's ear, but this is surely a very difficult incident in the relationship between the Holy See and Washington. And it's true that when John Paul II died, Clinton said of him that he has left a mixed legacy. So that kind of sums up, in a certain sense, Clinton's view of JP.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think, the Iraq War and several other things we've sort of touched on. I guess I alluded to earlier, I thought I'd mention WikiLeaks as sort of, it didn't rise to the level of Iraq, but I think it's kind of an interesting case study in some ways. That, and I don't know if everyone remembers, but a U.S. Army private got access to a database of diplomatic cables, thousands of cables, more than that, including many from Embassy Vatican, many with my name on them, unfortunately. And when these were then published in the newspapers, it was very difficult because again, the private diplomatic conversations you have are supposed to be just that. And the interlocutors that we had, they told us things that they wanted us to report back to the State Department because we were trying to work certain common interests together. But they certainly trusted that they would be reported back in confidence. And so, for example, one cable was leaked in which a priest from Venezuela had come to see us at the Vatican. He wouldn't have gone to see the Americans in Venezuela because it would have been too dangerous for him, but he went to see us, told us a lot of things about the situation under Chavez and some internal things that that he wouldn't have wanted to go out under his name. But when that was leaked, he was in great danger, and his family as well. So not unlike in some of the countries where these leaks happened, our officials had said some derogatory things about other leaders. That didn't happen so much in our case. It was just more betraying confidence in that sense.
I want to turn to some questions from our viewers here. This is the first of the unfair questions of the afternoon, okay? Is it better or worse to have the Catholic in the White House? Is the fact that the current president of the United States is a Roman Catholic, does that make Vatican-U.S. relations easier or more difficult? What do you think? And in Biden's special case, because Biden has a prehistory as a vice president of dealing with the Vatican, what role did that, if any, have in this? So you can leap in there anywhere you want.
Well, it's very different from the situation of Kennedy, the first Catholic president, who made it absolutely clear that he was not going to kowtow to the Vatican. He certainly made it clear that he's not going to establish diplomatic relations between the Americans and the Holy See. Very deliberately, if you remember, the day after Paul VI was crowned as Pope, Kennedy could have been in Rome for the coronation. He deliberately decided not to and went off to Lake Garda or somewhere and spent the night. But when he came, he made it absolutely clear that he was not going to kiss the Pope's ring, and he did not. And they shook hands. But interestingly enough, his wife kissed the Pope's ring, oddly enough. So Kennedy was hypersensitive to the fact that he was the first Catholic president, and therefore he has to deal with the Vatican in such a way as not to give the impression, and this was the Protestant prejudice after all, that a Catholic in the White House is going to kowtow to the Pope. We're in a very different situation now. Quite a lot of those prejudices, not all by any stretch of the imagination, as you know, Mark, since you've written on this, most of those prejudices have now kind of died away. I think the difficulties with Biden are in the area of those, hard button issues of, abortion and so on, and the idea that whilst he's personally against it, this is not going to inform his conduct of affairs as president. There are a number of issues like that, I think, which make the relationship complicated. Now, it so happens that Francis and Biden often seem to be singing from the same hymn sheet, if one may use an ecclesiastical analogy. But Francis isn't going to be there forever. And
Oliver, let me press that. So singing from the hymn sheet, same hymn sheet with regard to what issues?
Well, with regard to things that you've raised, like migration, for example, the treatment of refugees, the environment, all of these things that are, and to some extent, issues of redistributive justice with regard to the economy. So Francis and Biden have a similar outlook, it seems to me. But the issues are complicated because of Biden's stance, shall we say, on moral issues, which has already opened up internally in the United States differences in the hierarchy.
Peter or Charlie, do you want to weigh in?
Just to follow on that, to answer the original question, I think it's an open question for now, but I think the initial signs are encouraging. And I only say that because I think the space to watch is the American Bishops' Conference and what the American bishops do. As Peter Martin has pointed out, the Vatican is a multi-layered institution. So too is the American Catholic Church. We have right now the very strange circumstance of the president of the Bishops' Conference, more or less in a very thoughtful way, condemning Joe Biden's public embrace of abortion issues. At the same time, the Archbishop of Washington has come out, made statements in favor of administering communion to President Biden on the heels of the 2019 incident where a parish priest in South Carolina refused to give Joe Biden communion and was met without any discipline by his superiors. So I think it's an open question. I think it'll be very interesting in a social media age to see how this gets resolved on these hard button issues, as Oliver said.
Peter, do you want to?
No, I think I think I agree with both of our colleagues. It's some of it's up in the air, and some of it I think is going to be played out internally.
Yeah, another question from the viewers was about President Trump and Joe Biden following Trump. There was some serious, as several of you have alluded to, serious words between Francis and President Trump when Trump was in the White House. And, you know, Francis basically said in no uncertain terms, people who build walls and not bridges aren't Christian, which is a pretty, I was kind of bowled over by that because I'm used to the Vatican sort of like clothing everything in diplomatic language, and that seems to be not a very diplomatic thing. But is there any leftover of that in U.S. Vatican relations at this point, or is that all moved on with the new president? What do you think?
I don't think so. I think that I think that there were a lot of challenges with the Trump administration for the Vatican, and part of it was the issues, as you mentioned. Part of it was also just that the Trump administration was not very well organized. So even on when the so-called Muslim ban came out, typically if you get a change in policy like that and you're in an embassy, you're going to get a cable announcing it a week or two in advance with some talking points. You can go into your host government and say, hey, this is what's going to happen. We're doing it for A, B, and C reasons. We wanted to give you a heads up. And that way you're going to get better comments, probably reactions from your host government, even if they don't agree with it. You're at least trying to bring them into the process. But in January of 2017 at the embassy, we found out about that from CNN, the Muslim ban, as did most embassies in the world. So, I went in and spoke to Vatican officials on my own afterwards to say what I could, but this was the kind of thing that was going on. And I think that Ambassador Gingrich did a really good job of finding the areas of commonality, and she and her staff, excellent diplomats who were there after I left, found the areas of cooperation, religious freedom, trafficking in persons, certain other things, and they made the best of it. But it was a difficult time.
Yeah, and I know that Francis was particularly upset by the Muslim ban because right from the start of his pontificate, he had to try to make up to some extent for what had gone on under Pope Benedict XVI and the infamous kind of Regensburg address. Now, it's true that even Benedict made amends for that, and we could debate the merits of the address. I mean, I think it was in many ways misunderstood. But Francis's policy had been one of openness to the Muslim world, to try to improve relations between Christianity and Islam. And he felt to some extent let down by Trump's ban for those 7 Islamic countries. And I believe that was the source of quite some annoyance, frankly, so far as the Pope was concerned, given his general policy of openness to the Islamic world and repairing relations between Christianity and Islam.
Charlie, do you want to weigh in?
No, I think that was well said. Thanks.
Okay, great. Another question from viewers is, all of you have mentioned the issues on which the Vatican and the U.S. government align, where they agree, especially now under the new Biden administration. What do you think were the 2 or 3 most salient issues or questions where President Biden and Pope Francis agree or would see eye to eye?
Well, the sorts of things that have been alluded to already: environment, social justice, the death penalty. If Biden abolishes it, that will be very much in conformity, not only with the thinking of Francis, but with the thinking of the Holy See as a whole, that it is an inhuman means of punishment. But I say that has been part of the policy of the Holy See for quite some time. So those are the sorts of things that they agree on: migration, refugees. Yeah.
Peter,
There could be something on COVID vaccine equity also coming up in that. But I think, yeah, and I think on climate, I think this, I mentioned Secretary of State Kerry's relationship with the Vatican. Now that he's the climate czar, I think that'll only encourage, he won't hesitate to go to Rome to talk to folks there. And I think that'll help that relationship along too on that issue.
interesting. Charlie, do you want to weigh in?
I think that was well said. I think covered those bases.
Interesting. I have another question from the viewers. What meaning, if any, was the moving of the U.S. Embassy out of the Villa Richardson and its relocation to the Via Veneto? Does that have any iconic meaning at all? Sort of for much further away, moving into a very, very wealthy neighborhood of Rome, where a number of embassies are, obviously. What meaning, if any, do you think that had?
Well, that was, someone had to carry the boxes during that move. I can.
Are you saying you carried boxes during that move?
Well, a little bit. It was a difficult situation. Obviously, it's really important for the U.S. Embassy to the Holy See to have its own relationship. It's not the U.S. Embassy to Italy. It's a bilateral relationship that's just as important as the one to Italy, if not more so. It's important to have that because it's a much smaller embassy. It's very important to have some distance and to have some autonomy for both the ambassador and the staff. And having a separate embassy, we had a beautiful embassy that overlooked the Circo Massimo, Circus Maximus. But it was the security of that embassy was not suitable. It was not really an embassy. My first office there, I had to duck my head because it was in an attic. It was an old villa, and so it made sense security-wise and logistics-wise to move to a bigger, more modern space that was, as we used to say, on the campus of the U.S. Embassy to Italy. And I think that the problem is that once you're on the same campus and you're dealing with sharing space with an embassy that has hundreds more people than we do at the U.S. Embassy to the Vatican, you have to really have some sharp elbows to say, okay, no, this is Vatican business, or this is our embassy's business. And it's not easy to keep that line. So it's I think it was a necessary move, but it definitely requires some safeguarding of that relationship.
Good. It's certainly true. It's one of the things that the Holy See, in fact, does not like. It doesn't like this sort of arrangement because it thinks that its status will be undermined by this. And therefore, it wants separate embassy, separate buildings between the ambassador to Italy and the ambassador to the Holy See. The Americans followed the precedent of the British on this, who moved the embassy of the Holy See onto the campus of the British Embassy to Rome. And again, lots of complaints from the Holy See. The British got around it in their typical kind of stalwart way by the embassy. It's enormous frontal, and at one end, at the right-hand side, you have Her Britannic Majesty's ambassador, embassy to Rome, and then the other, Her Britannic Majesty's ambassador and the embassy to the Vatican. This is the kind of the gesture that they made to the Holy See to get around, frankly, the disappointment and the complaints, because it is a kind of something deeply held by the Vatican. They don't like this sort of arrangement. But I perfectly understand Peter's point that there were issues of security involved, and obviously it's easier to protect the diplomats in a bigger campus and where you have more security personnel and so on and so forth.
But essentially, when the British did that, we were still trying to resist. In my previous assignment, we were still trying to resist pressure to move, and I was writing cables back to Washington playing up that upset the reaction of the Vatican, so that to keep us in place as we wanted to as long as we could.
There's a question from one of the viewers addressed to Charlie. Charlie, you mentioned earlier in this webinar that about the Vatican archives, and the Vatican archives not going to be open for quite a while. Do you think the opening of those, in terms of what's in those archives, do you think that the opening of those archives would make U.S. Vatican relations easier or more difficult, more challenging?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question because currently we're dealing with that in the initial stages of the World War II and the Cold War period, with the recent opening of the archives of Pope Pius XII. And so part of that whole discussion about the opening of that archives itself was the place of that papacy in global history during the 20th century. And in many ways, what was a technical issue for historians and archivists suddenly became a question for interreligious dialogue. It became partly a question of diplomacy in terms of the mechanics of it and the framing of that particular question. And so using that as a focal point and extrapolating further, we don't know what we're going to find in those archives, and we don't know what issues will arise when we are able to look at the documentation and see if the public diplomacy matches what was going on in the private conversations between principals.
Interesting. Peter or Oliver?
It seems to me that that might be true of the Cold War and how Pius XII conducted the affairs of the Vatican so far as the Cold War was concerned. I'm not so sure how much more we're going to get so far as the Second World War is concerned, because don't forget, the Vatican has already published, beginning in 1966, 11 volumes of documents. The problem is that the Vatican at the time had all of the documentation translated into French, it being, of course, the diplomatic language. And I'm afraid quite a number of our colleagues, Charlie, don't read French, and therefore they have not had access. But Monsignor Burns, for example, who was the Vatican archivist in the 1980s and into the 1990s, he's now retired, he might even be dead. He said on one occasion that pretty well all of the documents connected with Pius XII and the Second World War have already been published. So I know that there are kind of slightly sensationalist colleagues of ours who hope to find and claim they've already found all sorts of damning new evidence against Pius XII. But I think we will have to wait and see.
Peter, any rumors among the diplomatic corps about this?
Well, no, just I mean, just to affirm that I've been in any number of meetings when U.S. Jewish groups visited the Vatican and made the point in past years that the archives needed to be opened, and so I think it was a lot of people were interested when that happened. So
Good. One last question from the viewers, addressed to all of you. Did Newt Gingrich's public and media pressure present any kind of challenges for diplomatic relations between the U.S. government and the Vatican? Peter, do you have any?
yeah, I guess I can't say what happened behind the scenes at all, but I expect that, I mean, Vatican diplomats are pretty savvy characters, and they're I think they're very wise also. I mean, it's the oldest diplomatic corps in the world. I think they know how to compartmentalize things, and I think that they are able very well to focus on the issues of cooperation or issues of disagreement, but focus on the issues and the cooperation at hand. I would be surprised if any of his media engagements would have caused any problems.
And as you told us earlier, his wife, in general, gave a good account of herself as the US ambassador at the Vatican. And that kind of balances up the verbosity of her husband on these other issues.
Good. Do any of the three of you want to have a final say, your final 2 cents before we end this webinar? What do you think in terms of either a question we did not address today or the repercussions of perhaps one of the questions we didn't explore? What do you think?
We didn't touch on Mike Pompeo. And if you remember how he tried to get an interview with the Pope in September of last year. And there was much made of this. And if I say so, I think the Vatican was slightly disingenuous to say the reason that we're not going to do this is because it is an election year. And we do not want to be seen to be allied with any particular party in the United States. That is commendable, of course. I don't disagree with that. But it seemed to me that the real issue was that Pompeo had challenged in his First Things article, challenged the Holy See on China. And the Holy See was rather unforgiving, I have to say, in this instance, and a bit ungracious. Don't forget that Pope Benedict made his visit to the United States in the election year of 2008. No concern there about influencing the outcome of American elections. It's true that he went in April and the election wasn't until November. This was a bit closer, but yes, I mean, I was slightly surprised, I have to say, that the Vatican, the Holy See, didn't maneuver that particular issue with greater finesse. Peter,
Charlie?
I would just say briefly that I think there are a lot of exceptions made, and we certainly had a lot of damage control to do when Bernie Sanders was coming out to the Vatican during the primary season some years ago. But that's a story for another time.
Okay, good. I look forward to that time. Charlie? Great. I want to thank our three panelists today who are excellent scholars and very smart diplomats. I want to thank them for their insights on U.S. Vatican relations. I asked the viewers to check our website. We have a number of important events coming up in the next 3 weeks, and you are most welcome to join us for that. Tomorrow, we have a day-long conference. It's a graduate student conference entitled The Pandemic and Religion, and 16 doctoral students from around the country will be giving various papers on that question. Should be quite an afternoon. So thank you, Charlie, Oliver, and Peter, and you'll be back. Don't worry, you'll be back. And thank all of you who are viewing. So God bless, stay warm, and get the vaccine. I will see you soon. Bye-bye.
All the best.